Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here in front of you to tell you categorically that Machiavelli has died. For years, we were deformed by thought, presenting a false dilemma when designing public policies. Where we had to opt between political efficiency in opposition to the respect for the ethical and moral values of the West. As Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto points out in his work on dynamic efficiency, from this point of view, efficiency is not incompatible with various systems of equity or justice, but arises only and exclusively from one of them, which is based on the respect for private property and business function. Therefore, opposition to the dimensions of justice efficiency is false and erroneous. That is, what is fair cannot be inefficient, and what is efficient is fair. And it is that from the perspective of dynamic analysis, justice and efficiency are two sides of the same coin. Without a doubt, it was Murray Rothbard who anticipated this situation with greater clarity, considering the connection that exists between the dynamic conception of economic efficiency and the field of ethics. Rothbard considered it essential to previously establish the adequate ethical framework that promotes dynamic efficiency, given the ignorance that we have about the purposes, means, and functions of utility that exist in reality. Thus, for Rothbard, which I attribute, even since my role as president of the great Argentine nation, only the underlying ethical principles and Western culture can serve as a criterion of efficiency. When it comes to making decisions on public policies, put in raw terms, at the time of designing public policies, it is inadmissible, from the point of view of ethics and morality, to sacrifice justice at the altar of efficiency. This slogan in favor of values is not only above economic efficiency, if not that it is still far above even more than what political utilitarianism is. Thus, leaving aside ethical and moral values, it derives from policies that are not only unfair, but also lead to collapse, not only economically, but also on the social level, to such an extent that it could end up ending Western civilization itself. Therefore, in 2024, in this forum, I pointed out that the West was in danger. In turn, in my expression in 2025, I showed that the agendas and policies that were being promoted from the different organizations and international forums were nothing more or less than a whole set of socialist policies, dressed elegantly to deceive people of noble and beautiful souls with good intentions, but with the same catastrophic results as always. That is why we should never forget the words of Thomas Shell about socialism, which recognize the merit that it sounds very nice, but whose face is that it always ends badly, horribly badly. Without going further and beyond the continuous disasters caused by socialism during the 20th century, we see the apparent damage caused in Venezuela, and not only by a drop in 80% of GDP, but even much worse in the light of the establishment of a bloody narco dictatorship, whose terror has tentacles spread throughout our American continent. For this reason, today more than ever, in the face of the ethical and moral degradation that the West faces, as a result of having embraced the new socialist agenda, it is necessary to resolve and push the ideas of freedom. However, unlike the way it was faced in the past, which was based on a utilitarian approach, today, the defense of the capitalist system of free enterprise must be based on its ethical and moral virtue. This is, as Israel Kirscher points out, the day socialists do not deny the superiority of the productivity of capitalism. They question it for being unfair. For this reason, it is not enough for the system to be more productive, since if its roots were unfair, capitalism would not deserve to be defended. Therefore, today I will show you that free enterprise capitalism is not only more productive, but it is also the only system that is fair. In turn, I will show you that there is no dilemma between political utilitarianism and politics based on values, since if they were in conflict, it implies that the basis of political utilitarianism must be discarded for being unfair. Therefore, this implies that if we want to get out of our present darkness, We must re-inspire ourselves in Greek philosophy, embrace Roman law and return to the Christian Jewish values, which will allow us to save the West. Much of human conflicts arise from a failed relationship between natural law and positive law. Thus, natural law is a law that must rule over the human being, because it is suitable for his nature, and therefore it is fair in a universal sense. It is a common law for all men because its essence is intrinsic, and therefore unchangeable and immutable. On the other hand, positive law is a one that men write to follow their convenience. In this way, when positive law is in line with natural law, there will be justice. In its defect, it will be legal, but it will not be legitimate. In function of this, two fundamental rights are recognized: the right to life and freedom. Man is born alive and born free, and he has the right to preserve these attributes of nature. In addition, he has the right to be respected by his fellow men in order to seek his own happiness, which is the end that every man has. In parallel, we have the rights acquired, which are neither natural nor inherent to the human being, for they themselves are earned by merit or attained by gift. In this way, the fundamental right to freedom derives from the right to property, and this is manifested in the fact that we can freely acquire a good with the fruit of our work, or we can receive a good that they freely give us honor or inherit. At the same time, the right to property, especially due to its dynamic consequences, is linked to the principle of the appropriation of the law, so that now the property can not only derive from a donation, gift, inheritance, or exchange, but also adds to the appropriation of the discovery and creation. Finally, these rights are complemented by the principle of non-aggression, which establishes that no human being has the right to initiate aggression of any kind against another human being, which not only includes physical aggression, but also all kinds of coercion, and imposition, under threat of use of force. From there, we define liberalism according to Professor Alberto Benitez Lynch as the respect and restriction of the next person's life project, based on the principle of non-aggression, and in defense of the right to life, liberty, and property, whose institutions are property rights, free markets, competition understood as free entry and exit, the division of labor and social cooperation. Naturally, associated with this social order, arises the question of whether it is just. Therefore, to determine whether the system is fair, the obligatory reference is opium, whose basic premise constitutes the foundations of Roman law, and is undoubtedly one of the pillars of Western civilization. Thus, justice is the constant and persistent will to grant each one his right. That is the intention of giving each one his own, what corresponds to him. However, opium's sentence did not stay there, but added to the principles of law, consist in living in an honest way, without harming anyone and giving each one what is his own. Therefore, one of the characteristics of free enterprise capitalism is that it is a just doctrine. Even the emerging institutional framework, which we have also proved that it is just. Now it is time to prove that it is also efficient. The first proposal on this was made by Adam Smith, who, using the argument of the invisible hand, argued that each individual pursuing his own interest led to maximum social welfare. Later, the neoclassics, guided by an idea of the invisible hand, based on the optimal of Pareto, managed to derive the first axiom of the economy of welfare. This is, all competitive balance is optimal of Pareto. However, this implied embracing a mathematical structure that left the doors open to state intervention, under the good intentions of correcting market failures, which, from my point of view, do not exist. For this, the proof that Hans Jamahop has developed, based on property rights, in line with the principle of original appropriation of the law, along with the principle of non-aggression, is not only satisfactory in proving optimality, but also leaves no room for state intervention. In this way, Hop points out, any deviation from this set of rules implies by definition a redistribution of property titles, and therefore of income, from users and buyers of goods to non-users, producers to non-buyers. Therefore, any deviation in this sense implies that there will be relatively less original appropriation of resources whose scarcity is known, and therefore there will be less production of need goods, less maintenance of existing goods, and few contracts in trade that are mutually beneficial. This naturally implies a lower standard of living in relation to goods and services that go hand in hand. In addition, the postulate that only the first user, not the last, of a good acquires the right of property, ever the same, ensures that productive efforts will be as high as possible at all times. At the same time, the notion that only physical integrity of the property, not the value of the same, must be protected guarantees that every owner will carry out the greatest productive efforts of value. This is, efforts to promote favorable changes in the value of the property and to prevent countering any change not favorable in the value of the same. Therefore, any deviation from these roles implies a reduction of productive effort at all times. Note that one pivoting on property rights and not on functions of excess demand derived from the exercise of optimization. It allows to achieve an optimum without the need of esoteric assumptions that later provide support to state intervention. At the same time, it avoids falling into the empirical ridicule at the second theorem in the welfare economy that postulates independence between production and distribution, as if the option between capitalism and communism was not possible in terms of result. Therefore, having proved that the institutions of free enterprise capitalism, sustained by natural right, the principle of the originary appropriation of the law, and the principle of non-aggression, not only that they are fair, but that they are also efficient, at least in static terms, it is time to prove that free enterprise capitalism meets all these same properties. In dynamic term, Xenophon, already 380 years before Christ, pointed out that the economy is a knowledge that allows men to increase their income, while postulating that property rights was the most profitable vehicle for the life of each one. After that, Xenophon deals with the concept of efficiency, which addresses it from two perspectives. On the one hand, from a static vision, it defines how efficient management of available resources is tending to avoid waste, where it also highlights the benefit of property rights by pointing out that the eye of the master is the best formula to fasten his castle. On the other hand, Xenophon, in his second definition of efficiency, enters the dynamic field, pointing out that, in turn, efficiency implies increasing the income. That is, it is about increasing the amount of goods available through business creativity, that is, through the life of commerce and speculation. This last criterion of efficiency is of fundamental importance for the study of the growth of an economy, since, unlike a static model, in which only contemplates what Robert Lucas Cheney defined as the profound parameters, that is, preferences, technology, and donations of initial resources. In the dynamic sphere, both technology and initial donations can be, and in fact they do so continuously, as a result of business creativity. In fact, a separate chapter obeys the institution of private property, and that by pointing out the Austrian school of economics, from Mrs. Rothbard Berkasa up to Jesus White de Soto, has demonstrated the impossibility of socialism, and therefore throw into the ground the idea of John Stuart Mill, who postulated independence between production and distribution, an idea that derived from socialism, and that cost the world the lives of 150 million human beings, when those he managed to survive did so in an absurd poverty. According to what has been pointed out, and in line with the second definition of his Xenophon analysis, the economic theory has identified four sources of economic progress. First of all, we have the division of labor, which was exemplified by Adam Smith in his work with the pin factory. In the end, it is a mechanism by which productivity gains are generated, which are manifested as growing yields, and that although its limit is limited by the size of the market, the size of it is positively affected by it. However, it is also worth clarifying that this virtuous process is not infinite, whose limit glides within supply of initial resources. Secondly, the development of both physical and human capital. Regarding physical capital, interaction between savings and investment is crucial, making the fundamental role of the capital market manifest as the financial system. To achieve this intermediation, on the human capital side, the focus should not be limited to the educational clan, but should also be considered the development of cognitive capacities. Since the birth of the human being, its food and health, fundamental elements for access to education in the labor market. Thirdly, we have technological progress, which means being able to produce a greater number of goods with the same amount of resources, or produce the same by using a smaller amount of supplies. Finally, we have the entrepreneurial spirit, or rather the entrepreneurial function, which, according to Professor Puente de Soto, constitutes the main engine in the economic growth process, since although the three factors pointed out are important, without entrepreneurs there will be no production, and the level of life would be extremely precarious, where the entrepreneurial function does not focus so much on short-term efficiency, but rather on the growth of the amount of goods and services, which leads to high levels of life. Based on all this, the truly important thing is to reach the maximum protection limit, so that dynamic efficiency can be seen with the capacity of an economy to promote creativity and entrepreneurial coordination. At the same time, the criterion of dynamic efficiency is indissolubly linked to the concept of entrepreneurial function, being Mr. typically human capacity to realize the opportunities of earnings that rise in the environment, and consequently, making the task of discovering and creating new ends and means fundamental, promoting the spontaneous coordination intended to solve market imbalance. On the other hand, this definition of dynamic efficiency, proposed by Puente de Soto, combines adequately and coherently the idea of creative distraction, or Schumpeter with the adaptive efficiency of Noto. Naturally, given the role of the entrepreneurial function, the institutions under which it develops are equally important. In this sense, both Tagos North and Jesus Huerta de Soto see as a key function of institutions to reduce uncertainty. Thus, while North presents it as a set of restrictions designed by the humanists that structure social interaction in a repetitive way, Huerta de Soto considers that these institutions, conceived by human beings, emerge in a process of social interaction spontaneously without the desire of a single person, which reduces the uncertainty of the market process. Thus, as Roy Cordato points out, the adequate institutional framework is the one that favors entrepreneurial discovery and coordination. So that in its framework, economic policies should be oriented to identify and remove all the artificial obstacles that hinder the entrepreneurial process and voluntary exchanges. In this sense, given the influence of determinants of the institutions in economic progress, they direct us to look at the importance of ethics, since those societies that adhere to moral values and more solid ethical principles in support of institutions will be dynamically more efficient, and with them they will enjoy greater prosperity. Thus, the ethical problem, fundamental to conceive as the search for the best way in to promote coordination and entrepreneurial creation. Therefore, in the field of social ethics, we come to the conclusion that the conception of the human being as a creative and coordinated act implies accepting with axiomatic character the principle that every human being has the right to appropriate the results of his entrepreneurial creativity, that is to say, that the private appropriation of the fruits of those who create and discover is a principle of natural law, because if the actor could not appropriate what he creates or discovers, then his ability to detect opportunities of profit would be blocked, and the incentive he has to carry out his actions would disappear. In short, the ethical principle that we have just announced is the fundamental ethical base of the entire market economy. Therefore, what we have just demonstrated is that the free enterprise capitalism is not only fair, but also efficient, and also generates a high rate of growth. Therefore, given the conceptual framework of dynamic efficiency and the existence of dilemmas between efficiency and ethical values when designing public policies, it is of interest its implementation in real life beyond the enormous achievements that we have shown during these years of management, stripping a fiscal deficit of 15 points of the GDP, lowering inflation from 300% to 30%, reducing the country's risk 2,500 basic points, and growing the economy, while poverty dropped from 57% to 27%, leading public policies to become more efficient and more efficient. I would like to focus on the Ministry of Regulation, or as we call it, the Ministry of Increasing Performance. This ministry is inspired by the evolution of the GDP per capita since the Christian era, which has the shape of a hockey stick. This figure comes from the fact that until 1800, the GDP per capita is almost constant, and from multiplied by 15 times, in a context in which the size of the population multiplied by 10 times. In parallel, while the GDP was growing, extreme poverty dropped from 95% to 10%. However, this wonder implies the existence of growing performance, which in economics is associated with the structure of a concentrated market, and that is where the dilemma of public policy arises between efficiency. In the Pan-Russian analysis, the growing performance implies the existence of known convexities in the whole of production, which does not allow us to derive the benefits functions maximum, so neither the supply of goods nor the demand of consumption are optimal. In the face of this, it is proposed to regulate companies and assimilate them to a perfectly competitive case. This called the growing performance of economic grace. If you do not look at the facts that regulation causes in all parts of the world, the vision based on the ethical values of capitalism indicates that if that position was reached by discoveries, voluntary exchanges them without violating the principle of non-aggression, there is no reason to justify intervention. In fact, the intervention is a violation of property rights, so that by punishing the benefits, the potential of the economy follows. Therefore, intervention and regulation are dynamically inefficient, being violent and therefore unfair. That is why since the arrival of my administration in 2023, we have carried out, thanks to the Herculean task of the Minister Federico Stasniga, 13,500 structural reforms, which today allow us to have a more efficient economy dynamically, which allows us to grow again, that is, make Argentina great again. Therefore, this shows the questionable analysis of the optimal Pareto. Based on it, many consider irrelevant that such concentrated structures are regulated, assimilating them into results of a competitive model. However, as I have pointed out, this implies killing the growing performance. His collateral effect is to kill growth. That is, under the same line, we can address the topics of artificial intelligence. In this sense, this instrument could be seen as a 21st century version of the pin factory of Adam Smith, that is, a potential of growing performance and with it, greater growth and well-being. Therefore, the most responsible that states can do regarding the issue is to stop bothering those who are creating a better world. To say it more directly, politicians must stop bothering those who are creating a better world. At the same time, I want to point out that all the views associated with dystopian scenarios are nonsense. The answer is Adam Smith. The limit of growing performance is given by the size of the market. Finally, we must not forget that the implementation of these projects requires real financial resources, so the expansion will be limited by the initial donations. For those who are interested in the theoretical foundations of these arguments that I'm presenting today, we must not forget that the implementation of these projects requires real financial resources, so the expansion will be limited by the initial donations. Today, Dr. Riedel applauded to the networks the work we did in collaboration, and we developed the theoretical foundations that regulation kills crime. In other words, the states are mephistoms, regulations destroy property rights, and that kills growing performance. We say that growth is less. Finally, linked to this phenomenal future that is coming, the role of human capital is of vital importance. In this sense, in Argentina, thanks to the management of the Minister Sandro Peradillo, our vulnerable sectors, we have stopped giving them fish, to teach them how to fish, and if it is possible to motivate those who believe in their own fishing company. Finally, despite popular criticism, free company capitalism did not touch moral values. After all, economic progress via the invisible hand mechanism arose from the moral feelings of Adam Smith, and the modern era owes its existence to the bourgeois virtues pointed out by McCluskey. In turn, thanks to the great work of Huerta de Soto in the development of the concept of dynamic efficiency and the investment in practice. In Argentina, this allows us to be sure that the dilemma between efficiency and justice is false. This says, markets are not only superior in terms of productivity, but they are also fair, and therefore public policies must be guided by ethics and not by utilitarianism, either economic or political, which always derive from unjust, populist, and impoverishing solutions. Therefore, I reaffirm what I said at the beginning of this conference. Machiavelli has died. Therefore, it is time to bury him. In fact, given the deep link between morality and free markets, the latter make us better people, since thanks to the dynamically efficient markets, we can at the same time progress economically, defend property rights, maintain peace, achieve social harmony, and strengthen those social virtues that are indispensable for a prosperous society. Finally, I want to give you a reflection on La Parallel this week. The parallel describes that moment when Miss says, "This is the Pharaoh," symbol of the oppressive power of the state, to warn him that if he did not free the Jewish people, the last 3 plagues would fall on Egypt. Faced with the Pharaoh's negative, the plague of the langostas came, which means hunger. Then came the plague of darkness, which means the loss of clarity for decision-making. Finally, the plague of the death of the firstborn, which leads the destiny of a society that denies freedom. The analogy with what happens today in the West is tremendously clear. A long time ago, the West, for some strange reason, began to turn its back on the ideas of freedom, and that is why in the same place, in the year 2024, I stated that the West is in danger as a result of having embraced a growing dose of socialism in its most hypocritical version, which is wokeism. At the same time, in 2025, I explained the mental parasites that the left planted in humanity. However, 2026 is the year in which I bring you good news. The world has begun to awaken. The best proof of this is what is happening in America with the rebirth of the ideas of freedom. Therefore, America will be the beacon of light that lights up the whole West again, and with it it will pay its civilizatory debt with a sign of gratitude towards its foundations in Greek philosophy, the right of the Romans, and in the Jewish Christian values. We have a better future ahead, but that future exists only if we return to the roots of the West. This is returning to the ideas of freedom. May God bless the West. May the forces of heaven be with us, and long life freedom. Thank you very much.